Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. On August 20th, 1957, a prospector named Albert Osman signed an affidavit attesting to the fact that he was abducted by a troop of Sasquatch some 30 years earlier. His account spread through Canadian newspapers like wildfire, and people laughed at him. They called him a liar. Either a kook or a crook. But William Rowe didn't think either of these things. He said, no, I have seen one of these creatures myself, and I am also willing to swear it. And that is precisely what he did, a mere 6 days after Osman went public with his account. The following is Rowe's signed and sworn affidavit in its entirety. I, W. Rowe of the City of Edmonton in the Province of Alberta, make oath and say that the Exhibit A attached to this my affidavit is absolutely true and correct in all details. Sworn before me in the City of Edmonton, Province of Alberta, this 26th day of August, 1957. Signed William Rowe, signed W.H. Clark, Assistant Claims Agent. Ever since I was a small boy, back in the forests of Michigan, I have studied the lives and habits of wild animals. Later, when I supported my family in northern Alberta by hunting and trapping, I spent many hours just observing the wild things. They fascinated me. The most incredible experience I ever had with a wild creature occurred near a little place called Tête Jaune, British Columbia, about 80 miles west of Jasper, Alberta. I had been working on the highway near this place, Tête Jaune, for about 2 years. In October 1955, I decided to climb 5 miles up Mica Mountain to an old deserted mine, just for something to do. I came in sight of the mine about 3 o'clock in the afternoon after an easy climb. I had just come out of a patch of low brush into a clearing when I saw what I thought was a grizzly bear, in the brush on the other side. I had shot a grizzly near that spot the year before. This one was only about 75 yards away, but I didn't want to shoot it, for I had no way of getting it out. So I sat down on a small rock and watched, with my rifle in my hand. I could just see part of the animal's head, and the top of one shoulder. A moment later, it raised up and stepped out into the opening. Then I saw it wasn't a bear. This, to the best of my recollection, is what the creature looked like, and how it acted as it came across the clearing directly towards me. My first impression was of a huge man, about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide, and probably weighing near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to toe with dark brown, silver-tipped hair, but as it came closer, I saw by its breasts that it was female. And yet, its torso was not curved like a female's. Its broad frame was straight from shoulder to hip. Its arms were much thicker than a man's arms, and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionately than a man's, about 5 inches wide in the front, and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the gray-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. It came to the edge of the bush I was hiding in, within 20 feet of me, and squatted down on its haunches. Reaching out its hands, it pulled the branches of bushes towards it and stripped the leaves with its teeth. Its lips curled flexibly around the leaves as it ate. I was close enough to see that its teeth were white and even. The shape of this creature's head somewhat resembled a Negro's. The head was higher at the back than at the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded farther than its nose, but the hair that covered it, leaving bare only parts of its face around the mouth, nose, and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of this hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and on its face much shorter. Its ears were shaped like a human's ears, but its eyes were small and black, like a bear's. And its neck also was unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I've ever seen. As I watched this creature, I wondered if some movie company was making a film in this place, and that what I saw was an actor, made up to look partly human, partly animal. But as I observed it more, I decided it would be impossible to fake such a specimen. Anyway, I learned later that there was no such company near that area, nor, in fact, did anyone live up Mica Mountain, according to the people who lived in Tête Jaune. Finally, the wild thing must have got my scent, for it looked directly at me, through an opening in the brush, A look of amazement crossed its face. It looked so comical at that moment, I had to grin. Still in a crouched position, it backed up 3 or 4 short steps, then straightened up to its full height, and started to walk rapidly back the way it had come. For a moment, it watched me over its shoulder as it went. Not exactly afraid, but as though it wanted no contact with anything strange. The thought came to me that if I shot it, I would possibly have a specimen of great interest to scientists the world over. I had heard stories about the Sasquatch, the giant hairy Indians that live in the legend of the Indians of British Columbia, and also, many claim are still, in fact, alive today. Maybe this was a Sasquatch, I told myself. I leveled my rifle. The creature was still walking rapidly away, again turning its head to look in my direction. I lowered the rifle. Although I have called the creature it, I felt now that it was a human being, and I knew I would never forgive myself if I killed it. Just as it came to the other patch of brush, it threw its head back and made a peculiar noise that seemed to be half laugh and half language, and which I could only describe as a kind of whinny. Then it walked from the small brush into a stand of lodgepole pines. I stepped out into the opening and looked across a small ridge, just beyond the pine, to see if I could see it again. It came out on the ridge a couple of 100 yards away from me, tipped its head back again, and emitted the only sound I heard it make. But what this half-laugh, half-language was meant to convey, I do not know. It disappeared then, and I never saw it again. I wanted to find out if it lived on vegetation entirely, or ate meat as well. So I went down and looked for signs. I found it in 5 different places, and although I examined it thoroughly, I could find no hair or shells or bugs or insects, so I believe it was strictly vegetarian. I found one place where it had slept for a couple of nights under a tree. Now the nights were cool up the mountain, at this time of year especially, and yet it had not used a fire. I found no signs that it possessed even the simplest of tools, nor did I find any signs that it had a single companion while in this place. Whether this creature was a Sasquatch I do not know. It will always remain a mystery to me unless another one is found. I hereby declare the above statement to be in every part true to the best of my powers of observation and recollection. Signed, William Rowe. Witnessed. As far as I can tell, William Rowe never tried to make a dime off his story. And by making the veracity of his statement a legal matter, he had nothing to gain, but potentially much to lose. No movie adaptations, no book deals or contracts. Just an interview with a newspaper, and the few researchers who sought him out. Rowe's motive was an act of solidarity. Albert Ostman's story broke a mere 6 days before Rowe came forward with his account. People across North America were bickering about Ostman's story, and Rowe just wanted to weigh in, which is the mark of a decent human being, in my opinion. Consistency is key in this field. Rowe's description of the creature he saw states that, quote, the head was higher at the back than at the front. Ostman described the creature he saw as having, quote, a narrow forehead that slanted upward round at the back about 4 or 5 inches higher than the forehead. And understand, Ostman did not mention this in his initial and brief newspaper interview. He only provided this description and these details to researcher John Green sometime later. Rowe could not have heard this detail from Ostman's account, as Rowe came forward only days after Ostman. So according to the timeline, these 2 consistent details came up independently. Any primatologist or physical anthropologist would conclude that this is a description of a sagittal crest, which is a ridge of bone across the skull used to anchor powerful jaw muscles. And what is truly astounding is how in the early part of the 1900s, this feature really wasn't even accurately depicted in most sketches of large primates. The fact that Rowe and Ostman came up with this detail, independent from one another, while even many academic and pop culture depictions omitted it, is remarkable, and no coincidence. The sketch is notably similar to the creature filmed by Roger Patterson. Some skeptics say it's too good. Rowe's sighting occurred in 1955, and he went public with it in 1957, and the Patterson footage was filmed in 1967. Skeptics have suggested that Rowe was hoaxed by Patterson and Gimlin a decade before they took their footage, or that Rowe was hoaxed by the same suit, though Patterson may not have yet been in possession of it, or that Patterson based his costume off of Rowe's sketch. But I'd suggest that maybe, just maybe, that they both saw the same species. What do you think is more likely? Besides, Rowe claims to have long held a passion for observing wild things, and he saw this creature for some time. He described its face and how it moved. Perhaps a suit can fool a person through grainy footage, but unlikely in person, especially with the technology available in the 50s. Besides, one would imagine that a hoaxer, be it Patterson or anyone else, would hesitate to debut their costume to a witness with a rifle. The creatures allegedly observed by Rowe and Patterson exhibit consistent behavior. Patterson and Gimlin claim that it was low to the ground before they saw it. Rowe states that it was squatting, and after the creature noticed him, it, quote, straightened up to its full height and started to walk rapidly back the way it had come. For a moment, it watched me over its shoulder as it went, not exactly afraid, but as though it wanted no contact with anything strange. Rowe's wording may appear problematic. Quote, watched me over its shoulder as it went. Patterson's creature doesn't technically rotate specifically, quote, over its shoulder, as Patterson's creature has essentially no neck and ostensibly turns at the waist rather than the neck. The creature in the footage seems morphologically unable to have, quote, watched over its shoulder. And yet those are the words of Rowe. One plausible explanation is that Rowe saw a younger individual, an individual younger than the creature filmed by Patterson, and just like humans, the large primates are certainly more flexible in adolescence than when they reach their mature, robust form. This is the same reason why, when we were young, falling off a chair was usually a non-issue, and now it is just a death sentence. So Rowe may have saw an adolescent individual, or perhaps he simply used a common phrase that was technically inaccurate, but still a common expression. However, Rowe did describe the creature's neck as, quote, unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. So it is likely, in my opinion, that when Rowe said it, quote, watched me over its shoulder, he may have been using a linguistic expression instead of giving a morphological description. And he does describe the neck as anatomically consistent with a creature that would be unable to specifically turn at the neck rather than at the waist or torso, which is consistent with what we see in the Patterson footage, and which is also consistent with large terrestrial primates, alive, extinct, and unverified included. And though the method of how the creature turned may not be worded consistently with the Patterson footage, the next statement is exactly what we see on the film. It went, not exactly afraid, but as though it wanted no contact with anything strange. And that is just such an appropriate description of the less than quantifiable attitude of the Patterson creature. I guarantee that Sasquatch spend a lot more time thinking about encounters with humans than humans spend thinking about encounters with Sasquatch. Another reason I find Rowe's report interesting is because it didn't really fit the mold of the time. Sasquatch, or wild men as they were more often called, were considered to be a tribe of feral, hairy, and unintelligent people, but people nonetheless. Rowe's account even mentions the prevailing mindset of the time. Quote, I had heard stories about the Sasquatch, the giant hairy Indians that live in the legend of Indians of British Columbia, and also, many claim are still, in fact, alive today. And though they were described as a tribe of wild or feral people, they were still described very much as people, not the distinct species that enjoys a devastating prowess within its chosen environment, as we more or less understand them today. The type of creature that Rowe described is one confident and comfortable in its surroundings. Rowe fails to mention any indication of tool use being a hallmark of humanity. So if the Sasquatch legend was one of giant hairy Indians, why did Rowe veer so far from the cultural perception of the time, if he was simply making it up? There are three aspects of Rowe's narrative that have been critiqued unfairly, in my opinion. First, that Rowe found 5 separate signs of the creature, and if these creatures were so careless, they would hardly remain a mystery to this day. Second, the fact that Rowe claims to have grinned at the creature's comical facial expression is a detail that skeptics have used to label the narrative as fiction. And third, he had a rifle. Would he really not have pulled the trigger? Rowe's creature does not seem all that cryptic, as he spotted it first, found 5 scat piles, and even a place where it had slept. If this was typical Sasquatch behavior, surely they wouldn't remain unverified. However, Mica Mountain is one of many portals to nothingness. I have no doubt that this individual likely had spent its 16 to 20 years on this earth enjoying an absence of humans, where we simply don't go, and cannot get to without a great deal of trouble. You will only meet an individual under these circumstances once, as obviously they learn quickly. I doubt there are many of these populations left, in North America at least. So it is feasible to me that the Sasquatch he encountered had yet to encounter a human, and therefore its cryptic behavior was at a minimum. But I'm sure that changed after Rowe encountered her, or she encountered him, whichever you prefer. Second, skeptics have had trouble swallowing the line, quote, "Finally the wild thing must have got my scent, for it looked directly at me through an opening in the brush. A look of amazement crossed its face. It looked so comical at that moment, I had to grin." This statement has raised some eyebrows, but not mine. Humans have enough in common with other primates to share facial expressions and react to them, like these shocked primates. If you interact with these creatures, you certainly respond to their reactions, just as they do yours. In fact, if Rowe was close enough to observe such a creature's face as he claims, and this detail were to be omitted, that would raise an eyebrow, because I'm confident that the facial expression of a creature in this situation would be funny. So for Rowe to claim that the creature gave a comical expression that caused him to grin is not a colorful additive to a fictitious narrative. Rather, it is precisely what we should expect. And the last unfair critique. He had a rifle. Would he really not have used it? I'd like to think that most people would not have pulled the trigger in Rowe's particular situation. He didn't feel threatened. It is not in the nature of most people to shoot at something that is so reminiscent of ourselves, particularly if that thing evidently means no harm. Now, I know this would never hold up in court, but definitions are very important in law, and law, ideally, is based off a shared sense of morality. Rowe even muses in his statement that, quote, "The thought came to me that if I shot it, I would possibly have a specimen of great interest to scientists the world over." What would you have done in Rowe's particular situation? Would you worry about forgiveness later? This is a rarely discussed factor in the puzzle to unmyth these creatures. Real hunters are hardwired not to shoot at the things shaped like people walking around in the woods. Unless that thing is threatening, in which case I think a person may be surprised to find just how ineffective their firearm may be. This is Travis. Travis was a pet, and he wasn't well. He was morbidly obese and kept sedated on Xanax. After stealing his keeper's keys and escaping his cage room and house, he proceeded to chew off the face of one of his keeper's friends. When police arrived, Travis walked over to the patrol car and opened the driver's side door, which the officer didn't think to lock, because it was an animal right. At which point the police officer fired 4 .45 caliber rounds into Travis's chest. Travis eluded capture for hours in the nearby woods, until he was discovered the next morning, slumped beside his bed, His right hand gripped the bedpost. A creature like the one Rowe described would be head and shoulders beyond the physicality and mentality of a drug-addled and obese chimp, who even still endured so long with his grievous injuries. At least he made it home. If you encounter a Sasquatch that needs to be shot, it is probably hard to take down. If you encounter a Sasquatch that doesn't need to be shot, you probably wouldn't want to shoot. It may not be a matter of should you shoot as much as is it wise to shoot. In my opinion, there is a good chance that if Rowe pulled the trigger, he may not have been around long enough to tell his tale. This chimp probably weighs between 65 and 75 pounds. And in this half-hearted 20-second altercation, the man required his lip, left ear, thumb, and 3 fingers sewed up or back on. And yet this is a pretty typical disagreement in chimp society. If this interaction were between 2 chimps, both individuals would likely have walked away with no lasting injuries. Humans simply are not able to repel the large primates. Physically, we mean nothing to these creatures. So a species not only physically superior, but in many ways mentally superior, is really not as big a stretch as it may seem. The final piece of Rowe's affidavit I want to mention. Quote, I hereby declare the above statement to be in every part true, to the best of my powers of observation and recollection. It is very important to keep in mind that if there is truth to just one of thousands of these reports, then there is truth to a whole lot more of them. Anyway, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.